ancient warriors, prophets, kings, politics, conspiracies. No, this is just thousands of years of truth and history. It's the Word of God. And I'm Wade.
And I'm Jen.
And join us as we add oil to our lamps, learning from and applying the Holy Scripture to our lives. As we set out in a dark world and uncover the things that want to remain hidden by shining the light of Christ. Awake, O sleeper. This is Out of the Darkness. Yes, hey everyone, Wade here, and we are going to be closing out on 1 Samuel. This is a compilation of 29, 30, and 31. I hope you enjoy the audio drama portion, and as soon as that's over, we're going to just roll immediately into the discussion portion of it. I am just getting over some sickness that's not the Rona. But it sure beat the crap out of me more than any Rona. Whatever. So I might sound a little more hoarse.
But wasn't you wanting that more John B. Wells type voice?
Look, if I'm being honest, a small portion of me wanted to keep the voice I had a few days ago that was even more hoarse and more raspy. But man, could I play around with the different voices. Oh, it sounded so awesome. I'm excited for this kind of closing out of 1 Samuel. And I think with this, we got some more stuff on the horizons. Really want to begin a new season with the podcast and the show and kind of mix things up and do some even more different things. And I hope you'll stay with us and join us. And with that, enjoy. First Samuel, chapter 29. The entire Philistine army now mobilized at Aphek, and the Israelites were camped at the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers were leading out their troops in groups of hundreds and thousands, David and his men marched at the rear of King Achish. But the Philistine commanders demanded, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish told them, "This is David, the servant of King Saul of Israel. He's been with me for years, I've never found a single fault in him from the day he arrived until today. But the Philistine commanders were angry. Send him back to the town you've given him, they demanded. He can't go into battle with us. What if he turns against us in battle and becomes our adversary? Is there any better way for him to reconcile himself with his master than by handing our heads over to him? Isn't this the same David about whom the women of Israel sing in their dances? Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. So Achish finally summoned David and said to him, I swear by the Lord that you have been a trustworthy ally. I think you should go with me into battle, for I've never found a single flaw in you from the day you arrived until today. But the other Philistine rulers won't hear of it. Please don't upset them, but go back quietly. What have I done to deserve this treatment? David demanded. What have you ever found in your servant that I can't go and fight the enemies of my lord the king? But Achish insisted. Well, as far as I'm concerned, you're as perfect as an angel of God. But the Philistine commanders are afraid to have you with them in battle. Now get up early in the morning and leave your men as soon as it gets light. So David and his men headed back into the land of the Philistines, while the Philistine army went on to Jezreel. Three days later, when David and his men arrived home at their town of Ziklag, they found that the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and Ziklag. They had crushed Ziklag and burned it to the ground. They carried off the women and children and everyone else without killing them. When David and his men saw the ruins and realized what happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more. David's two wives, Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel, were among those captured. David was now in great danger because all of his men were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters. They began to talk of stoning him. But David found strength in the Lord his God. And then he said to Abiathar the priest, Bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought it. Then David asked the Lord, Should I chase after this band of raiders? Will I catch them? The Lord said to him, Yes, go after them. You will surely recover everything that was taken from you. So David and his 600 men set out. They came to the brook of Besor. But 200 of the men were too exhausted to cross the brook. So David continued the pursuit with 400 men. Along the way, they found an Egyptian man and brought him to David. They gave him some bread to eat and water to drink. They also gave him part of a fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, for he hadn't had anything to eat or drink for 3 days and nights. Before long, his strength returned. Well, to whom do you belong? Where do you come from? David asked him. I am an Egyptian, the slave and a Amalekite, he replied. My master abandoned me 3 days ago because I was sick. We were on our way back from raiding the Kerethites in the Negev, the territory of Judah, and the land of Caleb, but it just burned Ziklag. Will you lead me to this band of raiders? David asked. The young man replied, If you take an oath in God's name that you will not kill me or give me over to my master, then I'll guide you to them. So he led David to them, and they found the Amalekites spread across the fields, eating and drinking and dancing with joy because of the vast amounts of plunder they had taken from the Philistines and the land of Judah. David and his men rushed in among them and slaughtered them throughout that night and the entire next day until evening. None of the Amalekites escaped except 400 young men who fled on camels. David got back everything the Amalekites had taken. He rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, small or great, son or daughter, nor anything else that had been taken. David brought everything back. He also recovered all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock.
"This plunder belongs to David,"
they said. Then David returned to the brook of Besor and met up with the 200 men who had been left behind because they were too exhausted to go with him. They went out to meet David and his men, and David greeted them joyfully. But some evil troublemakers among David's men had said, "Why, they didn't go in with us, so they can't have any of the plunder we recovered. Give them their wives and children and tell them to be gone." But David said, "No, my brothers, don't be selfish with what the Lord has given us. He's kept us safe and helped us defeat the band of raiders that attacked us. Who will listen when you talk like this? We share and share alike, those who go to battle and those who guard the equipment." From then on, David made a decree and regulation for Israel, and it is still followed today. When he arrived at Ziklag, David sent part of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends. "Here is a present for you, taken from the Lord's enemies." The gifts were sent to the people of the following towns David had visited: Bethel, Ramoth Negev, Jatir, Eror, Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, Rakal, the towns of the Jerahmeelites, the towns of the Kenites, Hormah, Borashan, Atak, Hebron, and all the other places David and his men had visited. Now the Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them. Many were slaughtered on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closed in on Saul and his sons, and they killed 3 of his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Melchishua. The fighting grew very fierce around Saul, and the Philistine archers caught up with him and wounded him severely. Saul groaned to his armor-bearer, "Take your sword. Kill me before these pagan Philistines come to run me through and taunt me and torture me." But his armor-bearer was afraid and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer realized that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died beside the king. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and his troops all died the same day. When the Israelites were on the other side of the Jezreel Valley and beyond the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and fled. So the Philistines moved in and occupied their towns. The next day, when the Philistines were out to strip the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off Saul's head and stripped off his armor. Then they proclaimed the good news of Saul's death in their pagan temple and to the people throughout the land of the Philistines. They placed his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they fastened his body to the wall of the city of Bethshan. And when the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their mighty warriors traveled throughout the night to Bethshan and took the bodies of Saul and his sons down from the wall. They brought them to Jabesh, where they burned the bodies. Then they took their bones and buried them beneath the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. on from 28 as we get into 29, 30, and 31. And so now the story is flashing back. It's going into little details about what's going on, but from David's perspective as these Philistine forces are gathering. And this is just exactly what freaked Saul out so much and what drove him ultimately to seek out guidance from a dead Samuel through a medium. And this is a pretty big Philistine front. Is doubly threatening because the last time fighting was done at Aphek, that's where they're gathering, that's when the ark was captured. And the Israelites were just utterly defeated. And that's when Eli, who was a rejected priest, and his sons died. So it's ominous because ultimately in 31, Saul, the rejected king, he and his sons are going to die too. So now David is in position with his Philistine army, and he has the rear position. What I think it's noted because it lends so much to the fact that the king, Achish, he trusted David so much, but of course not the other generals. They at least had a head on their shoulders, and it was a head they wanted to keep. They never liked having him around, and they had not forgotten about the fact that, there was actual songs. Actual songs were sung about his exploits and victories over them. Saul has killed his thousands, David has tens of thousands. So the trust wasn't there, and the rear position was perfect for anyone with any possible shifting allegiances, right? And it's the generals who make this point. They say, what better way for him to get back with his master than by delivering our heads to him? And it's a completely valid point, and really the king wouldn't have been able to have a leg to stand on in that argument. And David being sent away, it works in his favor though. And he ultimately gets sent away, and I don't know, and the text doesn't make it clear to me what David would have done if he had to ultimately go to battle against his own countrymen. Did he have an inkling that the others wouldn't have let him fight? So he just showed up to make himself look better in the king's eyes? I don't know. These are also times where David is being shifty, deceptive, and crafty. And even with all of this, there's these little bits and pieces of reminders that God's providence is over this situation, and they're spread out throughout the chapter. Little reminders of David's calling, but again, they're from the mouths of enemies, from the mouths of Philistines, right? When the Philistine king acknowledges the Lord, he says, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest with me, and it seems right for you to march out with me." That the Philistine king, he's not so much a worshiper of Yahweh, but he does recognize a divine influence and power that David has had in his life. And I think it's notable. And the fact that it's recognized from the Philistine king is huge. And so again, this dismissal is another providential, God intervening circumstance that has prevented him from going into the very battle that would ultimately claim the life of Saul and the lives of his sons. So as this is going on, you have Ziklag, the town where David and his wives, children, all of his men's families, the place where they had been staying, ransacked, burned to the ground. Ziklag was raided and plundered by the Amalekites while David and his crew were out. And now we're dealing with the Amalekites that were supposed to be dealt with by Saul, but he refused to kill off the king like he was supposed to, and this led to this whole rejection by God. So now David and all of his men, they're having to deal with these Amalekites. They wept bitterly, but luckily we're told that the Amalekites didn't kill anyone. They just took everyone captive. And the scene, though, is dour. It's so dour that David's own men want to kill him. And I think we're seeing a very common and easy route that we as human beings tend to take in these situations, right? When everything seems lost and hopeless, when there's terror, calamity, when life literally looks like there's ruins, it's just ruins. Sometimes a lot of us tend to blame the first person we see, or we pick someone to place blame on almost without so much of a thought. And I think it's because it's tangible. And David's men are in a state where David has become the embodiment of their losses. Then we have the flip side, David, despite the fact that he suffered losses as well. The text says that he found strength, or he strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And I think this is so clearly a demonstration of faith in difficult times. He asked the priest, he's got Abiathar there, that's the one who got away from Saul, to inquire God through the ephod if it's even a possibility to attempt to recover what was taken. See this as a direct contrast to what Saul does in times of trouble. God doesn't communicate with Saul, especially since he had all those priests killed. Now, David has a relationship with God, Saul does not. Let's also look at the fact that in this event, David, who showed some hot-headedness in the last few chapters, is now convening with God first before heading off into a revenge-fueled bloodfest. And I think there's some development here for some reason. David has had injustices handed to him that were less offensive, where he was ready to kill everyone in sight. I'm thinking of Nabal here. But could all these experiences, both good and bad, have tempered and forged something within him, developing, shaping, molding David into a model of faith for us today? He's still got faults just like us. We'll read about more of those faults later on, but the fact that there's this contrast between David and Saul, that contrast is from where do these men seek their guidance? And I think we see an important lesson in reflecting on this. In the face of trouble, who or what do we seek? Who or what do we look for? Or two, in direction, whose direction do we seek? Where's the guidance coming from? So reading further into the chapter, God gives the go-ahead and lets him know that everything's going to be recovered. Go ahead and pursue these guys. And the fact that they run across the Egyptian slave, that's another sign of the providence involved here, and the fact that he's on the right track. They find the Amalekites, they find their families, their livestock, everything that was missing. And these Amalekites, they didn't seem to be expecting any retaliation either, because they're found eating, drinking, dancing. They're celebrating the spoils from what seemed to have been a pretty successful ransacking of Ziklag. No one was expecting such resolve from David. Remember also that everyone was pretty exhausted from their journey from Aphek to Ziklag, then on to pursuing these Amalekites. So much so that a third of David's forces stayed behind to look after the equipment because of exhaustion. But as David found the raiders, it was almost like a new strength was found, because he and those with him, they were killing these guys from twilight to evening the next day. After everything, they take back what was theirs and then some. And of course, David is wanting to distribute the spoils to all his men, but in fact they weren't having any of that, because they felt the ones who stayed back didn't deserve anything of what was captured, save for their families. But what's revealing in David's character is in his reply, when he tells them it's the Lord that protected them, and the Lord was the one who had brought the victory, and that everything should be shared and would be shared equally. Those other guys did provide a function, and that even though they stayed back, they were guarding their equipment. And it also kind of, foreshadows. I think of the body of Christ and how we all have different functions but operate under the same spirit. Men in the world, they always place value on gifts of the Spirit and to whom God distributes them to, which has made so much spiritual abuse in churches possible, but I'll digress and talk about that on another show. But we know truly that God shows no partiality, and all who are in Christ are the same in God's eyes, regardless of role or position. And that makes me reflect on this, that when we're in the thick of it, and when God has us on a specific path, He does provide the strength for us to continue walking so long as we're looking to him for that strength and for that guidance, the importance of seeking divine guidance in severe crises. I think that's something important to take away here. And I know it's easier said than done, but look at David here. And that's why I love reading back here in the Old Testament. It's such a record of the human condition with all of its corruptions and imperfections, and the divine's reach toward humanity, and just how it exposes everything and brings things to light. Knowing that God is truly in the midst of us, even when we're in the deep, dark recesses that we retreat to. When we finally get to chapter 31 here, this here really kind of continues the sequence from 28, and is also the fulfillment of Samuel's prophecy when he was speaking in front of the medium. And Israel has lost this battle with the Philistines. They're being slain, and the remaining are fleeing from Gilboa. Now, using archers is an effective tactic to inflict a potentially fatal injury, as it seems Saul and his sons, they were singled out as arrows rained down on his position. And eventually he struck, and unable to fight, gave Saul, I think, an incentive to not be captured. Possibility of being treated the same as some of Israel's judges in the past could have entered his mind, if he knew that much. When the judge Samson was captured, his eyes were gouged out, and he was made to do slave labor. Being surrounded by so much death, Saul, he asked his arm bearer to run him through with his sword so that the horrors that he possibly dreamt up couldn't become a reality, though. Sadly, though, he's echoing a similar fate as another judge, Abimelech. If you remember, he's a judge who's also guilty of mass murder. See, think of Saul and he murders the priests of Nob. Abimelech also has all of his... He and the citizens of Shechem had his half-brothers killed, about 70 of them. But one day in battle, a woman on top of a tower dropped a millstone on Abimelech's head, crushing his skull. See, he too asked his armor bearer to kill him with the sword, because he didn't want word to go out that he died by the hands of a woman. I think it's interesting how much history repeats itself and how lessons go unlearned. But Saul's armor bearer was too afraid. Saul had to take his own sword, and when he did, he fell on it. And Saul's sons were among the many casualties, and the battle was so one-sided that the next day, as the Philistine soldiers went out to the field to strip the dead of their belongings, Saul and his sons' bodies were laid out. Still, not one person from Israel had even attempted to recover them. In fact, any Israelites in the surrounding cities abandoned them. They took off. So the Philistines took Saul's armor and his head and had them displayed in the temples of their idols, and had his body fastened to a wall in Bethshan. You see, the placing of Saul's remains in their temples kind of signifies to the Philistines about Dagon's victory over Saul. Some of those Ashtaroths, which it talks about, those were images of the Canaanite goddess Ashtoreth. It was some sort of consort to Baal. But luckily, Saul and his sons' bodies were eventually recovered in the dead of night by brave men from Jabesh Gilead. See, the men of Jabesh Gilead had been grateful for the exploits of a younger Saul in the past, when he saved the city from the tyranny of an Ammonite king, Nahash, who threatened the citizens to either surrender the city and gouge out your right eyes, or essentially be destroyed. It was a time when the Spirit of the Lord came upon Saul powerfully, and it led to a great victory and a renewal, almost like a revival, albeit a shallow one, to occur in Israel, much like its new king. It's a sad reminder to a more noble start this king had. When the remains were brought back, they were burned and buried, and people mourned and fasted. And I wonder if some mourned for Saul in a different way. Mourning the loss of nobility, the loss of one losing their way. It's a cautionary tale that I think everyone can take heed and learn lessons from, because remember, Saul had every bit of ability to carry out the things God expected his king to do. But every ounce of strength he had, every resource that could have been devoted to the Lord, he used for his own purposes. The same strength that he used for hunting and pursuing David could have been done against the Amalekites, against the Philistines. And these very things that God told him to deal with, that he was tasked to do, he neglected. He was a man who, in the eyes of his countrymen, looked every bit the part of a king like the nations around them. But inwardly, though, there lacked a fear and knowledge of God. It was a physical representation of the spiritual condition of those who wander from truth. And it all eventually drove Saul to madness. His poor decision-making led to his fate. Saul's tragic end is similar to so many in the world today, and in the past, it's a sad reality of life. Many have walked on, and many are walking now who strayed from the narrow way. People who started out with noble intentions, diligently walking along, who didn't have the strength to stand when faced with adversity. I think it's an important lesson that many of us need to reflect on, and we need to keep checking ourselves. Many of us go out with each day with noble intentions, charge head first, walking the path that's laid out before us, confidently taking each step, but inevitably down the road, stones get laid in the way. There's potholes in the road. There's things that can make us trip and stumble and fall. And sadly, when people trip, stumble, or fall, they don't get back up. I think it's a cautionary tale. Make us to remember to stay humble, because in a state of humility, we're open to learning. And as we're open to learning, and I'm speaking of learning from God, learning in spirit, we're open to be shaped, we're open to be molded, we're open to be tempered and tried and tested, so that hopefully through adversity, through hardships, through crisis, through loss, through all these things, we have the strength to stand and keep walking. And we can look to a model of faith like David, who after suffering so much injustice, knew who to look to in those times. I think there really is something to the passage that says we need to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Saul didn't have the fear of the Lord in him. He didn't have a relationship with God in him. His knowledge of God was fairly shallow. And he was without excuse because he could have been surrounded by priests. He knew Samuel. And I think this whole past time in 1 Samuel is a great reality check and a great tool for reflection in each one of our lives, and especially if we have a ministry, or especially if we are taking part in serving, ministering to God in some way. Know that we're not too strong to not succumb to fiery arrows, right? We shouldn't be so confident that we get in the mindset that we could never be tricked by anything, right?
Well, I mean, thinking of that, like we could see a great example of that is David's son Solomon, right? So he had a lot of knowledge and he did good throughout, the first part of his life. And then as he went on, like he got more like wives and more wives from different cultures. And so then they brought in their gods. And then I think for a certain part of his life, he followed their gods. Like he worshipped Yahweh, but he also worshipped like Ashtaroth and all the other false deities. And like I think that's a perfect example, because later on in life I believe he turned back to the Lord, but there was a good portion where I feel like he was smart, but at the same time he was dumb.
Yeah, and I think that there's something there that makes Saul's story so tragic, is I don't think he ever, he never, once he killed off all those priests for even even suspected them for helping David. That's when he, I think, seared his conscience, seared, and he's just going. That's in every bit of remorse or emotion that he gives off. I mean, the whole thing is him worried about securing himself a dynasty, securing his lineage, and that totally goes over what God's intentions were, to the point where he's essentially, I don't know whether knowingly or unknowingly, he's fighting against God.
Right.
And I think that sometimes we unknowingly fight against God when we get so focused on I don't know, tangible means. So this is always a portion in the Bible that I like to read fairly regularly, because I got to keep myself in check. Saul started out on a good foot. He was chosen.
Right. And, if he would have did the things that he was supposed to do and followed the Lord's lead, followed him, then I think things would have turned out a bit differently for him. But instead, he got so fixated on, there was that one time where he sacrificed when he wasn't supposed to because he didn't want to wait for Samuel. And that was kind of the start of his decline. And then after David was anointed, then he just really started rolling faster down that hill, building momentum. And he got bitter. Hatred came in, and he tried to kill David multiple times. And it didn't end well for him. And unfortunately, he took his sons down with him. And I was really sad when I read Jonathan died, because I'm like, he seemed like a good one. He seemed like a friend of David, one that was, kind of had David's back. And then because of all the stuff that happened, and he went out to battle with his dad, and he ended up, losing his life.
Yeah, I think when people are on such a destructive path, it can become a black hole of sorts, and it just drags as many people possible in. So, again, this has all been really, I think this is an essential tool for reflection in one's life, in one's walk. And I know there's a lot of people out there who stray off. I know there's people out there who, think they've strayed off. And I just hope as each day moves forward that more people will find that perhaps a seed has remained in their heart that was sowed long ago, maybe. And that heart is tilled just enough for, something to grow so that they can return. So that they can find those eyes that see and those ears that hear, so that then the fruit, that seed could bear fruit. Because that seed of the gospel, that seed can lead people out of darkness